My issue with the response to the Binance hack is what it really showed to me is there is a certain contingency in Bitcoin who don't believe in Bitcoin's fundamentals and are authoritarian.
Hello, welcome to episode 66 of The Bitcoin Game. I'm Rob Mitchell. My second interview at the recent Bitcoin 2019 conference in San Francisco was with Jeremy Rubin, a fascinating guy who has contributed a ton to Bitcoin. In this interview, we learn about Jeremy's background, we discuss his current project, a BIP intended to help with scaling pressures, and we revisit Jeremy's controversial idea of a Bitcoin reorg as a response to the recent Binance hack. Jeremy provides some super compelling content that I think you'll enjoy.
That's pretty good.
Great.
Okay.
Yes. All right, Jeremy Rubin.
Hey, how's it going?
It's cool to be talking to one of the core contributors. So when did you get started in Bitcoin?
I first learned about Bitcoin in the summer of 2011, and I was in high school at the time. Later that year, I mined a little bit of Bitcoin, maybe like 0.25 Bitcoin on a laptop, and then after an hour or two, it was running hot, so I just shut it off. I was like, eh. A few years later, 2013, I started looking at Bitcoin again more seriously as I was an undergrad at MIT, and thought it was really cool and started delving in a little bit more seriously. Was
there anything like a libertarian bent or anything about you that you think helped guide you to it, or not at all?
Most certainly. So I've been relatively libertarian for a while. I have some photos of me during my senior year of high school with Ron Paul, which exists somewhere on the internet. And then what my first project was in the Bitcoin space, I built an early web miner in 2013 with the idea that I could replace advertisements on websites with cryptocurrency mining. That was called Tidbit. The notion there was that advertisements are actually kind of evil. They have this, wanton political influence power, which we've seen manifest as a pretty bad thing, or, depending on your political view. On the outcome, but as a bad thing, at least, that we are subject to, foreign agents able to buy advertisements for, domestic elections. Also, the architecture of advertisements are bad from a user freedom perspective because they track users across the internet in order to build more accurate profiles and understand behaviors. So the other issue that I saw was, as a content creator, having an advertisement on your site is kind of bad. It's saying I'm selling out in order to show you this other thing. If you're watching a video series, you spend on YouTube 5 minutes watching a video and you spend a minute watching an ad. And so using 20% of your time seems also kind of an offense to the creator, but also bad for the use of the content. And good platforms like Wikipedia, except for their own fundraising efforts, they don't show you advertisements. It's focused on the actual content being shown. So I thought, if all of those content creators, journalists, video creators, if they can instead just ask that the visitors to their website mine cryptocurrency in the background, everyone can willingly give up their computational power. It's something that you don't actually really care about because you're using the device to consume the content. As long as you can see the content in an unimpeded way, you're fine to use these spare cycles. I thought that would be something that would be powerful in making the internet more free and giving more users liberty. Unfortunately, the state of New Jersey disagreed with that, and the Tidbit project went into kind of a protracted legal battle where they felt that having these web-based miners in lieu of advertising was essentially felony hacking. And so they went after us on some pretty serious charges.
Oh, my gosh. So it's funny you're bringing that up. I listened to a really mainstream podcast called Security Now, and someone basically put out a kind of a miner that with kind of that theory, but then it just got used in malware, I guess. Mm-hmm. But the host of that site brought that idea that you had so long ago to my attention, and I thought, that would be the best ever. Like, why? That sounds so much better than advertising, the tracking, and all that stuff. So you think there's ever a chance that something like that could work out? I mean, God, I think it's great.
I think there is a chance. I think one of the nice things is that with cryptocurrency mining, participating as a miner is a really easy way to do a micropayment. You can show exactly how much work you've been producing, and then the host of that site can meter the content to you based on that. It doesn't require setting up any sort of wallet. It doesn't require you to actually retain the asset before you need it. You just need to be able to get electricity, and it's also relatively fair. When you visit a website, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but the website might decide to show you content or not show you content based on who you are. Do you have enough money that you're worth showing this content to, that you're worth advertising to, that we should spend bandwidth on? Whereas with cryptocurrency mining, anybody who shows up with a laptop, could maybe be enough. Unfortunately, the reality is with Bitcoin mining today is a laptop would run for the life of the universe and never come up with a coin. But I definitely think that research into maybe memory hard algorithms, things that are a little bit less hard to farm out, or a little bit harder to farm out, would possibly improve that story. Or maybe laptops come with a built-in mining chip, and that's just kind of one of the ways forward.
Right. It seems like Monero is the coin of choice for a lot of these things right now.
Yeah, so I think that there have been. I'm not familiar with the current companies that are doing this, but I think there's one that's Hive or something like that with Showtime. I think that's phenomenal. I think that's really great. I can't comment particularly on the economics of if it is actually worth it to do, because I haven't looked at them. I think it really is. I would much rather have cryptocurrency mining than see 20% ads. My time is really valuable, and I'm willing to pay, but oftentimes people aren't permitted to pay or can't pay for various reasons.
Besides, you still liking the idea? Are you active in any way to try to move this forward?
I think that given my battle scars there, it's something that I've not focused on.
Okay.
So there's a particular attorney general in New Jersey who you can shout at if you're upset about that.
Wow. Okay, what led you down the road of being a programmer and a libertarian, do you think?
So I think in terms of being a programmer, there's definitely some family history there of MIT is not a legacy school. So your parents going doesn't necessarily indicate that you'll go. There's other institutions nearby who have different policies, around that. But my father went to MIT and studied electrical engineering and computer science, and so it was always something that was kind of, there. And his father was a radio engineer, back kind of before computers were really around. And so I think that sort of scientific and engineering thing is something that's strongly in my family. So that's probably why, it came to me as, a natural thing to focus on. In terms of being a libertarian, I think that I'm just probably pretty stubborn and pretty justice-minded, and I think that that's where libertarianism entered my worldview. And that's from, I have stories from before I can really even remember that my mom tells me of specific actions I took around not compromising and things like that I think are consistent with how libertarians view the world. So maybe I was also born into that.
Okay. So not from your family being diehard libertarians or anything?
No, there's no, I don't think, well, maybe genetically, I don't know, but I think that's just me.
Well, I'm always curious about the programming because I don't know if I'm sure I'm much closer to your parents' age than to your age, but my mom was a programmer in the 60s, and she was got a what they call Phi Beta Kappa for her math, and I mean she had that kind of brain, but somehow I didn't follow. I mean, I think I could have, but I don't think I had the perseverance. It's I hate the work. I remember my mom when we got a Commodore 64, going through the magazines and entering all the code to make a program. And I was like, psh.
Well, the American phrase, I think it's American, that I'm a soldier so that my son can be an engineer, and he's an engineer so that he can be a poet, or just kind of, or whatever the progression is. So I don't think it's necessarily that what your parents do binds you to what you do.
I kind of wish I would have. And now I have a son, and I kind of want him to go that way. I can see he does have an interest and aptitude, but like me, a little lazy maybe. So I'm just trying to understand.
Well, the best programmers are really lazy. That's kind of a fact, because good programmers write less code, not more.
Okay, I guess it's just even sitting down and learning. He's doing what's it called, Scratch right now.
Oh, great! Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah, I have actually some interesting feelings on pedagogy for young children. I don't know how old your son is, learning programming that I think actually like C is really approachable for kids because kids are highly logical. They can follow a set of defined rules, and as long as there's no magic going on, they can understand exactly what's happening. And then all these like kind of like graphical platforms and interactive things, they hide a lot of the details, and so kids might not necessarily have the intuition for why things should be that way or that way. Versus C, it's kind of like what happens. The downside with C is it's like less fun.
Okay.
You do something, and the end result is that it outputs a list of names. Whereas like some of these graphical things, it's like you move a cat across the screen, and that's like more fun than.
So I just realized you're talking about C, the letter C.
Yeah, the programming language C.
For some reason, I thought it was some kids thing called SEE or something.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah,
just
C. Plain. Probably what your mom was writing in the '60s. C.
I don't know. I remember her talking about like COBOL and Pascal and all those kind of things. But okay.
Yeah, any of those where the I think exposing the inner workings of the computer and what's actually happening. The topics aren't that complicated. They're relatively understandable. There's no magic, and I think that if you just want to understand how computers work and how programming works, those are, at least from my experience, I was able to teach my cousins who are like 10 a lot about C programming, more so than I think they learned by doing some of these scratch things. So.
Maybe you're a natural teacher.
Yeah, maybe it's me.
Yeah, well, maybe. I just interviewed Jimmy Song, so maybe you should start to, I don't know.
Yeah, we can do a C programming class together.
All right, so after your attempt to fix Bitcoin monetization or website monetization, what was next for you in Bitcoin?
Yeah, so after we got this kind of legal smackdown from the state of New Jersey, and kind of while that was going on, I was at a crossroads of, should I keep on doing this stuff? It's really interesting, but man, has it made my life hell. Of course, I decided, yeah, let's keep on doing it. So in the March of 2014, thinking about what would be an interesting project to do with regards to a class that I was TAing, where as a TA you're supposed to do a project in this class. I said, wouldn't it be really neat if we gave all of the MIT computer science students $100 of Bitcoin? What would they do with it?
Oh, wait, was that the big, well-publicized thing?
That was, yeah.
That was your idea?
That was my idea. Wow. And then I spoke to my friend Dan Elitzer, who's over at IDEO now, and I said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And he said, "No, don't just do the computer science students. Bitcoin is for everyone. Let's do every undergrad." And I'm like, "Okay, it's a little bit more ambitious, but yeah, let's try it." And so then over the next 6 months, we fundraised and then eventually delivered out to most of the MIT undergrads $100 of Bitcoin, and are still kind of monitoring and seeing the results of that experiment.
Okay, and that was right after the big spike at the end of 2013.
Yeah, so I think that the students ended up getting something like a quarter to half a Bitcoin. So if they held on to that, they're pretty happy now. But of course, I hear a lot of stories of people like, "Oh man, I bought sushi for a date, and that was where I spent all my Bitcoin, and now I could have paid off half of my remaining student loans. What was I thinking?" It's like, well, I don't know. Hindsight 2020.
So obviously you're saying you're still kind of seeing the results of that, but
yep.
Any other stories or anecdotes?
Yeah, so one of the professors we worked with, I removed myself from access to the actual data because I felt it would be improper for me to be able to kind of spy on my peers. So I don't actually have direct insight there, but there are 2 papers out from Professor Christian Catalini at MIT. And he was able to kind of look at, based on how he structured the experiment, the results of delaying early adopters access. And he was able to, you'll have to read the paper for the exact results, but more or less show that if you deny an early adopter status, they might permanently drop off.
What are you saying? I'm not sure I'm following what you mean by deny an early adopter status. What does that mean?
So let's say you're Facebook. And Facebook starts by only allowing university students to get onto the platform. So among university students, the only users who are going to go on initially are early adopters. Those early adopters are going to be hooked. But early adopters who are, let's say, post-college, let's say they just graduated and they're not able to join Facebook, but they're still an early adopter, may never adopt Facebook. And I don't think that that's completely accurate because, those people maybe retain their emails and there's enough early adopters who really wanted it. They could get access, and Facebook did eventually push out really aggressively, but it becomes an uphill battle for them because they restricted the initial early adopters. And that's kind of the message, is that if you want to launch something, your most dedicated users are going to be your early adopters. So do everything you can to let those early adopters on soon. Otherwise, they'll become your adversary. They'll be more resistant than they would have been otherwise.
Okay.
Because that early adopter status is important for people.
All right. Well, I will look that up and put a link in the show notes page.
Yeah. I hope I represented the finding correctly, but
people can find out
Yeah.
for themselves. And do you have any idea how much dollar-wise, like how many students received $100?
About 70%, I think, claimed their Bitcoin. 30%, were too busy.
But
or
what's the
not
raw
interested.
number there?
So that is, I think, 70% of 5,000. I think maybe the actual number was like around 4,000.
So who were the sponsors of this project?
So there are a lot of people who prefer to stay anonymous,
Okay.
but largely it was MIT alumni and Bitcoiners, so people who are at that intersection, and then their kind of immediate friends. People that you would know would be like Alex Morkos and Suhas After, the Chain Code Labs.
Mm-hmm.
They were big supporters of the project early on. They were kind of the first check-in, if you will. They said, this is a great idea. We want to help do this. So I have immense gratitude for them for making it happen.
So I assume they had Bitcoin rather than dollars?
Yeah.
Was it all Bitcoin donations?
So because of MIT policies, we kind of had to take the capital in dollars, not Bitcoin.
Oh.
Also because the stipulation of the project was we wanted to give people $100 of Bitcoin, whatever the market price was. We didn't want to give people, a tenth of a Bitcoin, which we could have done that instead. But I think that there's, and we don't necessarily have a rigorous scientific thing for this, but there's something important about $100, right? $100 is like a serious amount of money to a student. It's not that serious amount of money where it's like, oh my God, $100, I have to drop everything to do to get it. So I feel that that's like a significant number. And doing $10, it's like, I don't know, $10 is getting lunch. And you do $1,000, that's too much. So 100 is kind of like the sweet spot of being a serious amount of money, but not too much that it's like, weird to give people that much money.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then what next?
So from that, we were really hoping that the airdrop would stimulate a lot of research activity at MIT. But what we noticed is that it was difficult for people to find professors who are really excited about this. And it was difficult for grad students who wanted to do projects to get the support they needed. And so Joey Ito and I then co-founded the MIT Digital Currency Initiative. And brought on Neha Narula, who runs it currently. We hired 3 core developers, Gavin Andreessen, Corey Fields, and Vladimir Vanderlaan. And that's still there today. After I graduated from MIT a year and a half later or so, I stepped away from the DCI because I felt it was in a position where it would continue to grow and thrive, and I think it has. And I started working on Bitcoin Core contributions and focusing on the open source technology and exploring the space, noodling on a couple startup ideas and so on.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Are there any specific contributions that you want to talk about? Or?
Yeah. So there's stuff that I'm excited about that I'm like currently working on and trying to, advocate for. There's also stuff historically that I'm, proud of doing, but I think, given the reach of your podcast, it would be important for me to, make my case for these things that I'm trying to get people excited about.
Sure.
Right now, when I pay you a Bitcoin, some portion of a Bitcoin, you immediately receive it and can immediately spend it to someone else. I think that is not how the world should work. And that's maybe surprising to people. I think what should happen is I should pay you the Bitcoin, and when you want to spend it, you should receive it. And so there's a slight difference there. You can kind of analogize to when you have a bank, and when you make a wire transfer, it spends 3 days processing, right? And after 3 days, the funds arrive in your account. Delaying the ability to spend from the ability to receive gives you a massive scalability improvement. because what you can do is you can prove to somebody, I've paid you, and at some time later, as block space becomes available at lower priority, they can actually finish receiving that transaction. So it's a little bit of a mental model shift, but it's similar to what Lightning Network is. In a Lightning Network channel, you open up a tab with somebody else, and you collateralize it, you lock up your funds, and then you could wait up to 2 weeks to actually get that money out of the channel if it ends up closing in the uncoordinated fashion, the contested case. So I think that generally changing people's understanding of how Bitcoin works as like the settlement layer is going to be important, and it's going to give us these big scalability gains. Concretely, what am I working on to do this? I have a new opcode, a new script extension proposal called OpSecure the Bag. What OpSecure the Bag does is it allows you to commit precisely how a coin will be spent. This is technically called a covenant, which have been floating around in the Bitcoin space for a few years, but have been controversial in their implementation. With OpSecure the Bag, I think I've nailed down all of the controversial points and made something that has very, very minimal technical risk to do.
What were the controversial points?
One of the main issues with covenants is they have an ability to recursively enforce themselves. So an example of this is I could have a coin which can only be sent to one of 5 addresses. And it can be only sent to one of 5 addresses permanently. With OpSecure the Bag, the way that it's implemented, you can't do this recursion. Everything has to end at some point. You can only do a finite number of steps of expansion, and then it will be an unencumbered coin again. And I've also put it inside of Taproot, which is another proposal that's out there. And what that means is that there's always the ability to, with full agreement of the participants, pull away any covenant. There's an ability to strip it of the covenant if everybody who's subject to it agrees. So I think it's a pretty powerful construct because what it lets you do is it lets you say, I'm going to spend this coin to another coin, and then that coin is going to spend it to 100,000 people. And so what that does is that says if you're Coinbase and you need to pay out 100,000 users in a single block, you can't do that right now. Now you can do a single operation, which goes into a single output, which everybody can prove to themselves can only be expanded out to pay them fully. So that's kind of the mental model shift of like when you receive money, you actually need to do a second step to receive it, but nobody else can steal it from you at that point.
So say this was in effect and you paid me. Now, you said you have to do some...
Yeah, let's analogize back to the bank.
Okay.
So let's say I want to buy a car from you, right? Should I bring cash with me? Not really. Cash is kind of like gross and dangerous. Do I want to give you a regular check? You're not going to accept that because the check might bounce. Instead, I get a certified check from the bank. And the certified check says this instrument is good for, let's say it's a cheap used Prius and it's $5,000 or something. So I get this certified check for $5,000 and I hand that to you, and you inspect the holograms on it. You go, okay, this is like a real, issued by the bank check. And then it's good for money, right? The bank is actually guaranteeing it, not myself, but it is still my money that I bundled up into it. That's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to make it so that instead of receiving actual Bitcoin in a UTXO, you receive a certified check for a UTXO. And you're able to take that certified check to the blockchain and verify that nobody else can spend that money, that it is yours, but you just do need to redeem it to actually get a UTXO out.
Okay.
And the kind of key insight is that you can scalably issue these certified checks. You don't need to issue, you don't need to do N things on chain to issue N certified checks. You only need to do one thing on chain, and you can issue as many as you like.
And say it was Coinbase wanting to pay 100,000 people. How is all that data? Is it all on chain?
So eventually the data has to go on chain. Over time, let's say in the middle of the night, obviously Bitcoin's global, but there's going to be some area where people are mostly using Bitcoin, and there's going to be some time where demand is lower. We can think about it as being the middle of the night for, a domestic focus thing. No one's doing any transactions. And so what you do is you say all the lunch hour transactions where most people are saying, oh, I need money off of Coinbase or I need money off of the exchange to pay for my lunch. I'm going to withdraw something. all of those operations can be postponed until the evening when there's less demand. And so what you see is a smoothing of block space. What's also important is because these certified checks are verifiable by anyone, you can cache those payments for a long time. And there's maybe an ability, and I'll say this clearly, I'm not advocating a block space increase, but because these things are provably spendable in only one way, there might be an ability to treat them at a space discount, conceptually. Actually doing a hard fork on Bitcoin to make more block space, probably difficult to do. But at least conceptually, you can imagine something that everybody has been able to sit on for like 2 weeks is probably well known across the network that including that space does not incur the same relay overhead as transactions that have just been created. Those are maybe harder to propagate and relay than ones that everybody can write to disk and just have available. So I do think that overall it makes better utilization of the bandwidth of every node because you can have things that get broadcast and can't be updated later.
Okay, so I'm not technical per se, but must be utilizing some kind of Merkel trees or something to...
actually, to make the protocol work, you don't need any Merkel trees. It's just a single commitment. And then you go from saying one certified check issuing transaction, and then you pop it, and then it issues all the certified checks at once. But you can also do a design where the certified checks are done in a Merkel tree. You have one thing, you pop it, and then you get 50,000 and 50,000, but compressed as one. And then you pop one of those, and then you get 25,000 and so on and so forth until you get an individual output. You can do things that way so that they're structured in a tree, and then any single individual can, at log number of the certified checks, redeem their money. And that kind of thing ends up working out relatively nicely depending on the exact parameters and user behavior. That's something that the proposal that I have is flexible, but will come from actually measuring real-world usage. It's not something that I can sit in an armchair and tell you what the best answer is there.
Okay. So I just keep thinking of the Coinbase example. Mm-hmm. Does that require the Merkle tree? Or?
So for Coinbase, it doesn't necessarily require it. They can do it without it. But what Coinbase might do is they might say, when you're asking a withdrawal, they might ask you, do you need to spend this money now? In which case, they're not going to use this at all. They're just going to do a regular transaction. Or can you wait? How long can you wait? And you might say, well, I'm willing to pay more fee to wait less time, or I'm willing to, I just want to have this money. It might even be inter-exchange. So you might say, oh, this is actually going to another exchange, so let them deal with it and let them have their cash flow problem. And then you can structure the tree such that people get, put on whatever priority basis, so that there's no, like Coinbase can say either they don't want to use the tree at all, they just want to pay people out, or they want to pay people out more quickly, or they can say, oh, look, these ones almost never need to be used, and they can be buried pretty deeply in a tree such that it might take, a week of low block space in order for them to clear out. That's kind of up to the user to determine what the right way of paying out is.
And could things get delayed if the mempool gets really full unexpectedly for a really long period of time? Or
so what's really good about this proposal is imagine you're Coinbase and you want to clear all of your liabilities. People can actually receive all their money with just a single transaction. So if you want to get that transaction in and it's really critical, you might end up paying on that transaction like 10 times the fee for just one transaction because you really want to make sure it gets into a block, right? You can also just pay normal amount of fee and it should get in. But I'm just saying, the worst case. Now, that could be confirming 1 million payments. And clearing out those 1 million payments will take actually a serious amount of time. As you point out, you would clog the mempool with those 1 million payments, and you would never be able to confirm them in a single block because 1 million is greater than the block space can support. So what I think is important to understand is that as soon as you've issued one of these payments, you fully receive the money. So the mempool has 2 tiers at that point. It has transactions that are waiting to clear things that are already fully confirmed and no one's worried about, and things that are actually truly unconfirmed. And processing those things that are truly unconfirmed will be a higher priority for people in terms of their willingness to pay than things that are actually fully confirmed but just waiting to process further. So it has a nice effect of splitting out concerns. The concern between waiting to be able to spend again and the concern between knowing that you received.
The Bitcoin Game is sponsored by BTCKeychain.com, probably the most well-known Bitcoin keychains in the world. Get your own. Just go to BTCKeychain.com. Is this actually going to be a BIP, or is it a BIP, or what?
It is a BIP. I've released it. There's still design work to be done to make sure that everybody is fully on board with the way that I implemented it. There have been a couple pieces of feedback that I'll incorporate at maybe slightly added complexity in the code base, but less complexity in what the opcode does. Getting adoption for an extension to Bitcoin is climbing Mount Olympus. It's a pretty difficult task to do. So I can't sit here and say, yeah, we're going to get it in a few weeks. It's done. This isn't, like another cryptocurrency project. This is Bitcoin.
Sure. I meant technically more than the politically making it happen.
So technically, the proposal is super simple. So I don't think there's really any sort of major qualms there. But I think the reason why I bring up the politics is what is important is to have strong advocacy from users if this does actually help their business use case, that they want this. And I think that what that means is more exchanges, more users of Bitcoin need to actually see if this proposal helps their real world needs. And then if it does, they need to just chime in somewhere saying, we like this. We'd like to see it. How can we support it getting in and getting merged?
Mm-hmm. How long have you been working on this?
Oh, geez. So I originally presented on this topic at BPACE, which is now Stanford Blockchain Conference. It used to be Blockchain Protocol Analysis and Security Engineering Conference at Stanford in 2017 of January 2017. My presentation then was reliant on covenants in their most powerful form. And I've kind of had several iterations of being like, well, are these weaker and are these acceptable to the community? Do these have minimal technical risk? And that's been basically a 2-year process to get to the point where people are like, this has very little technical risk. We think we can safely do this. We'll get all these benefits.
Is anyone helping you with this?
Not really.
Wow.
I mean, obviously the community has started to review it, but for the last 2 years, it's been mostly just myself thinking through and trying to figure out how to make this happen.
So have you been talking to exchanges or people you think would benefit from this?
I have started that outreach process. I feel comfortable that there's enough technical consensus that this is an acceptable idea, that I'm okay socializing it more broadly and getting people's feedback and asking if it's something they support. I don't think anybody's had any reasons that they don't like it. I think everyone's pretty excited. So, to the moon.
Wow. Well, that's really cool. I've learned a lot about you today. Do you want to talk about the Binance thing, or just don't even want to go there?
I mean, I'm not opposed to talking about it. I think that, as I said, I'm a pretty staunch libertarian. So when I think about the role of a scientist in this space, it's kind of like the role of a lawyer in the court. I'm here to tell people, this is what you can do. These are your options. This is the space of possibility. Here's how Bitcoin works. I have no, as an agent of truth, essentially, in the space, operating with somebody else, I can have my personal feelings about what they should or shouldn't do. But ultimately, I'm a scientist. I want to understand how the protocol works. I want to understand how people's incentives can be pushed around. I want to know if Bitcoin is weak. These are all things I want to know. And when I'm dealing with an individual, I want every individual to be able to exercise their full, and most voracious defenses, right? And I think that that's what everyone should do. And I think long-term, that's what everyone will do. And so there's my issue with the response to the Binance hack is what it really showed to me is there is a certain contingency in Bitcoin who don't believe in Bitcoin's fundamentals and are authoritarian. And so what they view their role in the community as being is if somebody says a truth or an idea, a thought that we don't like, our job is to viciously attack them for that. As a libertarian, I think that ideas can be dangerous, maybe, but I think that fundamentally the free flow of ideas is critical. And as somebody who is long-term trying to make Bitcoin as good as possible, I want to know what the actual ground truth is on the incentive structures of the system. And so looking at the Binance thing, when the hack happened, it was still a relatively small number of blocks out. And I said, hey, look, you can easily, out of the coins that were stolen, subsidize enough to rewind, the blocks up to that point. And you can make that offer.
Okay, so it was just a few blocks. It wasn't.
It was, I think, maybe like 30 blocks when I saw it and when I tweeted. And the message around there is not that they can do a reorg, it's that they can make this offer. And if you read my original, 2 or 3 tweets there, what I say is that most likely the attacker is going to counteroffer. But as Binance, your incentive is to make that attacker counteroffer. Because if they don't counteroffer, they get all the money. And if they do counteroffer, they get much less money. And you want to make it really scorched earth for anyone trying to attack an exchange. That's what I think people would want long term, is to make these attackers much less profitable. So that's why I suggested it. That's actually the nuanced conversation that I had with Binance, kind of out of the scope and purview of Twitter discourse. About,
does that mean CZ or other people there?
Yeah, with CZ and other folks there, we had a little discussion room about like what it would look like, a proof of concept for the code to actually do it within that time window, and just what the implications were. And I think that's where it's really like, yeah, we're scientists and we're operating kind of like legal counsel for the court of the blockchain, and I just personally couldn't fault anyone for having that conversation, for understanding what their options are. And I think that's where it's just like, to me, it's a little bit foreign that people are upset that like CZ didn't necessarily, before my talking to him, understand that this was a possibility for him to do this. And I think that kind of points to needing broader just education about how Bitcoin actually works. And people should have, not in their time of crises, trying to understand what they should do, but have a plan ahead of time that they can know, this is my option, we're not going to do this because we have determined that this is like not the rational thing for us to do, or we are going to do this if this happens. So if you're an attacker, there's really nothing for you here because we are going to do this and you're going to have to counterbid to prevent the rollback. So that's kind of my feeling. I think one thing that's also an interesting point that emerged is a good number of people felt that if CZ had issued this rollback incentive within a 6-block time window, they wouldn't have really been that upset because they view 6 blocks as being this like really important number. Some exchanges take 2 confirmations, but a lot of exchanges take 6 confirmations. And so as long as you're within that window, it's less bad for the network as a whole. And so I think that that's just something that scientifically I'd like to understand, and getting more data on that is interesting to me. Understanding how coordinated miners actually are is interesting to me. A lot of people just would prefer not to know and want to protect Bitcoin with, authoritarianism. But as a, libertarian scientific mind, I just want to know what things are. And if Bitcoin fails the expectation that we want, I want to make Bitcoin better.
Did you have one-on-one discussions with people afterwards, or was it more just kind of like a media public discussion?
I've had some one-off discussions about it. I think a lot of people felt that it was really stupid for me to tell CZ that it was an option, and I respect that as an opinion. It's like not like it's like my unique idea that this exists, but people have talked about it before and had maybe similar reactions. I don't know. I think that it's just a disagreement about the scientific process for Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And that's, people are entitled to their opinions on that.
So how much do you think that kind of just opens the door, not what you said, but just the reality, or maybe reality, of rollbacks and attacks? And, do you see attacks that, a state actor or something could perform as far as that kind of stuff? That would...
I certainly do. One of the examples that I think is powerful, and this is where I originally started thinking about the economics of a rollback, is if you imagine that you believe that a fork to Bitcoin is value destructive for Bitcoin. So you believe that Bitcoin after a fork to Bitcoin plus Bitcoin next Bitcoin is going to be worth Bitcoin minus Bitcoin next. You want to stop Bitcoin next from happening if you think it's like bad. Right? You want to keep everyone in the same tent. That means that you are willing to spend a certain amount of money, based on the expected value you think of it succeeding. So what it's possible to do is, let's say you had 100,000 Bitcoin, which there are companies that do, and there are people that do probably as well. You could say, when Bitcoin next happens, I am going to issue a transaction on Bitcoin to move all my funds into a new wallet that only exists on Bitcoin. Then what I'm going to do is on Bitcoin Next, I'm going to reveal my private keys. And what that does is that makes an incentive which is 10,000 times greater than the block reward on Bitcoin Next. That means if you structure it correctly, Bitcoin Next might not be able to get consensus on a new block because there's greater incentive to undo the last block and claim that one transaction. And so what it can do is it makes this coordination issue that miners on Bitcoin Next have to become coordinated enough to agree how to deal with this transaction. I think that that's where it's really interesting, is that these types of attacks can actually serve as a protection mechanism for Bitcoin if you think the forks are bad. But they also can serve as an issue for Bitcoin itself because there's nothing to stop a Bitcoin Next whale from doing the same thing on Bitcoin. They can issue a big transaction on Bitcoin that's releasing all their Bitcoin. I mean, it may be stupid, but if they're truly believing Bitcoin Next is going to be it, and they think that Bitcoin continuing to exist is dangerous for Bitcoin Next, they're free to similarly attack Bitcoin. I think that that's where, at least from a scientific perspective, I want to deeply understand how these reorg incentives work, and I want to build things that prevent them from being actively used. So that's kind of my general stance. Whether a state actor can do this or not, certainly, right? If a state actor wants to acquire 100,000 Bitcoin, and they're going to ease into the market, and they're going to put this as their retainer, it's a little bit like a Bitcoin nuke if these reorg incentives actually work, and they can just hold on to that latently until they're like, we need to stop Bitcoin, and then they can deploy those funds and fuck up all the incentives for Bitcoin, potentially, depending on what miners actually have implemented under the hood and how miners view their ability to get liquidity, what their time preferences. And that's where I just want to understand. So I think these are real risks. I think the messaging around it being impossible are not accurate. I think it very well is possible, if not at 7,000 Bitcoin, if not at 70,000 Bitcoin, at 700,000 Bitcoin, at 7 million Bitcoin. Like, those are bigger numbers, but at some point, Bitcoin fundamentally starts having problems. Now, on the flip side of that, as a scientist and as an engineer, what I want to understand is, can we build mechanisms that make these infeasible? So one example of a proposal that I think is interesting that I put out in the following of the Binance hack is something that's kind of like reverse proof of stake. And reverse proof of stake is you providing keys for coins that you already spent. So let's say you spent your coins 2 weeks ago, and you're not going to reuse those keys because you're using best wallet practices. You reveal those keys to the world, and you say, look, I will never go back 2 weeks because I will have nothing there. I've lost all my funds in that event. And you can imagine walking that up, and you can say, look, if I'm an exchange and I'm going to permanently go out of business during a 100-block reorg, I can release keys that are 100 blocks ago. And by releasing those keys, I can socially signal that, no, if there is a reorg that goes past that, I'm not going to accept it. So that's where there's kind of some interesting mechanisms that we can, and this isn't fully fleshed out. There's some practical issues with a scheme like that. But that's sort of the type of thing that I think is worth exploring is, can we make some sort of finality layer on top of Bitcoin if we're actually going to depend on a finality layer just being people are rationally incentivized to do this? Can we increase our confidence that they are actually rationally incentivized to stick on the main chain?
So you said if it was an exchange, you'd say, well, we're not going to accept it because obviously that would be bad. How does an exchange not accept something?
Not accept a reorg?
Yeah.
So what they would essentially be signaling is that by releasing their keys from a transaction in a block at, let's say, a block with a specific hash A, or A, B, C, D, whatever, like long hash value, they're signaling that they've checkpointed that, and that they won't accept a chain that doesn't have that in its history. That's all they're doing.
So if if these are pretty basic questions, if one exchange doesn't want to accept it, but everyone else does, then what?
They would be, essentially what they would be doing is they would be, the contract you would have with the exchange, every user has a certain contract for deposit with every exchange that they're on. For some of them, it's that we have more future business interest than your measly deposit, and so we're not going to steal your money because we'd rather make revenue. Okay. For others of them, there actually is a legal contract that says in the event of bankruptcy, you as a deposit holder have rights to your deposit before creditors of the company. So these things are certificates of deposit. It's not actually the funds of the company, right? There are different legal contracts for people's individual deposits. And with Bitcoin, because of the forks, there's been some legal development on what does an exchange owe you if there's a fork. If Bitcoin, Gold, Bitcoin Diamond, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, does the exchange actually have to provide you those coins? And the general sort of message is they don't have to. They just should tell you before you make the deposit what they're going to do, what their general plan of action is. And that can sometimes be difficult based on how the forks are actually played out. The forker might make it really difficult for an exchange to take advantage of it. But that is where an exchange can say, look, we aren't accepting forks. Our exchange, no forks allowed, and you know what? We'll prove it to you. We're going to reveal these old keys every 100 blocks, and we won't accept any fork.
Gotcha. Okay.
We won't accept any reorg. We'll just burn those funds. You won't be able to get them if you do business on our exchange. And that might be bad, but if generally people are opposed to forks, it's good. This exchange seems like it's going to be a better place to, in the larger social system, do. The question is, how do you make that a Nash equilibrium? How do you make revealing this information in everyone's individual interest rather than being greedy and not doing it yourself? So that's an open question.
Man, Bitcoin is seeming more complex talking to you suddenly. Oh, man. So Matt Corallo is pretty well known for, hey, this is beta.
Yep.
Are you kind of in his camp, too, as far as how, some people are sure Bitcoin is forever or whatever?
I think that from a harm reduction point of view, I'm not. I think that Bitcoin, for a lot of people, is better than what they're currently using. And it has stronger, protections and capabilities. And I think that people can, tolerate that risk compared to the other risks. I think, there's nothing that is not without risk. In terms of it being beta, yeah, it's absolutely in beta. Like it's not in beta, like a web browser. A web browser is like pretty easy to use at this point. It's pretty secure. There's still problems with web browsers. There's still risks using a web browser. And I think similarly, web browsers, there could be a world where they're still considered to be in beta, right? Because, it's not like a printed book where we, really know how to do printed books at this point. I think Bitcoin will eventually be at the point where they're as accessible as a web browser. Anybody can get their wallet. You have a choice of wallets. They can support multiple different assets. There's a difference between managing your keys and managing your logical wallet, your keys being your authentication that it's you wanting to make the thing, your wallet being your way of understanding where your money is and in what formats it's in. So I think that there'll be some evolution there over time, and it will become less like a beta product. But right now, I think it's still difficult to use in a lot of cases. Making it easier to use and more well understood what the potential pitfalls are is going to help push Bitcoin into a point where it's not really an open question of whether it's ready for any user. It's ready.
What do you think the odds are that whatever you want to call Bitcoin is here in 10 years?
I would say the odds are pretty substantial, and I'll give you a tautological answer for why, which is that as long as I'm here and as long as I'm working on Bitcoin, there'll be something I'm working on that I'm calling Bitcoin.
Okay.
So I think that that's what I like about the libertarian nature of Bitcoin is really I don't necessarily like some of the Bitcoin forks, but I'm okay with them. I think that that's their right to do it, and I think that they can do it. I don't have any interest in stopping them from doing it personally, except for maybe economic interest.
What about the popular complaint that it's brand confusion and people think they're getting Bitcoin, but they're getting...
I'm sensitive to that, but ultimately I think that for a lot of organizations, making a specific decision on that might be more difficult for them than for not making that decision. And I think having more neutral parties who deal as agents who aren't making that decision for users is actually probably good for user freedom in the long run. That if you decide that you care about Bitcoin Cash instead of Bitcoin, like that's your fundamental choice, and I'm not going to try and stop you from doing that. I'm not authoritarian on that sort of aspect. I think my point about the 10 years from now is I think that there is a pretty substantial chance that we will be in a world where talking about a hard fork of Bitcoin being Bitcoin or not won't be a real conversation. There's a pretty reasonable chance that we'll have to hard fork, that there'll be a bug discovered. Hopefully not, but it seems, relatively likely that there could be a bug discovered that causes, really causes a hard fork to happen. And if people disagree with fixing that bug, even at, large cost to the network, so be it. I don't know what that bug is, so I'm not saying which side I'll be on, but I'm just saying that, it's probably, reasonable that a hard fork might be something that people are on as a result of a bug fix, because I think Bitcoin should match people's expectations in a certain sense. And there is a space of reasonable expectations, and I don't think that includes having bugs that are deleterious to most users. But I could be wrong and outside of the norm of most other people on that. But I'll be working on the one that I think is best.
All right. So just to go back a little bit, the name of your project that you wanted to focus on?
So that is OpSecure the Bag.
That's right.
So, the name is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's because it's, kind of get that money, get it secured, but also, Andrew Yang is trying to propose to pay every American $1,000 a month, and if you want to do it on Bitcoin, the natural way to do it would be with OpSecure the Bag.
Gotcha. And is there a place people can go to find out more about that?
So the best place to stay up to date on Bitcoin research and development is by monitoring the mailing list. But that's kind of, old tech and most people don't follow it. I'd recommend subscribing to Steve Lee and David Harding and John Newberry's mailer called Bitcoin OpTech. They have good coverage of OpSecure the Bag and related technologies, and I think it's good from it's a good high level, but also pretty technically concrete about what the benefits are without getting too in the weeds.
Do you have your own GitHub for that, or is that just all part of Bitcoin?
I have the proposal in my own fork of the BIPs repository, and I've emailed that out, so anybody can go and read that BIP and tell me what they think about it. I welcome the review.
But no .com, securethebag.com or IO.
Maybe I should. I did buy a domain name recently, but I don't know if I'm super attached to the name yet, so still figuring that out. Personally, I'm if anyone's listening out there is this is such great work, and how do I support it? Well, I'm currently an unfunded, independent developer, so if, I'm looking to either figure out grants or funding to support my continuing to work on this stuff. Cool.
And on a personal level, how difficult was the blowback from your Binance suggestion?
Ultimately, not that difficult. It's upsetting in certain senses to see sort of the categorization of people as being more authoritarian than I feel I am, or also, just stressful, and people are being angry, and anytime people are being angry, it's upsetting. But I largely stand by my actions for the reasons, and hopefully that's not the soundbite of I stand by my actions, but I stand by what I said. As a scientist and advocate of truth and understanding, I think it's a reasonable thing to talk about. So I'm don't have any, wouldn't have done it any differently, I don't think. And then, I don't know. Dealing with, the state of New Jersey was more stressful.
Really? So are you not very emotional? I guess I just would figure all these people seemingly angry at you could be upsetting, You're made of something that didn't affect you. You need concrete threats like the state coming down on you?
Yeah, I think that there were some sort of veiled threats or things that people made, or kind of represented of you'll never work in this town again kind of stuff. And I think that's just silly. Hopefully Bitcoin is a meritocracy and the best ideas win, and it doesn't really matter who's bringing them up. We don't know who Satoshi is, right? And we don't care, hopefully. It's immaterial to Bitcoin, as a philosophy and as a project. So I think generally I want the space for discourse to be wide, and to allow space for the best ideas to rise up and for the best understandings to rise up. So I think anybody who's looking at this as an instance and thinking Jeremy should be really upset or scared or anything, I think that all of the people who, and this is a lot of people who are more scientifically minded, they might think it's a bad idea, but it's part of the conversation, and they hold, as far as I can tell, no grudges about it. So I think that that's really speaks to the power of the Bitcoin community and its philosophy around openness of ideas. And that's really the main thing. The people who are like really angry and just shouty, they don't write any code, so I don't really care.
All right, well, I wish I had a little bit more of that. I think all these people being mad at me, I'd crawl under a rock. Even you're only affected by real concrete threats.
That is not an invitation, by the way.
No, again, I would have probably been emotionally distraught after that. I'm glad that you weren't.
I would just say that it's probably other people were more emotionally distraught about it challenging their assumptions of how Bitcoin works than I was about the whole thing, because it didn't reveal anything new about Bitcoin to me.
Okay. So, again, just a lot of people hating on you. That would affect a lot of people, but I'm glad it didn't injure you. Yeah,
let's just say I had difficult years in middle school, so I'm used to it.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Let's see.
I mean, I could ask you a million questions, but I figure we got a lot of good content there.
I think we got plenty of good stuff. So I will leave you there. Thanks so much for having me on. And hopefully can come on another time and tell you about another new exciting development.
Okay, well,
in the future.
Keep me up to date on your project, because I don't know. Do you feel like a lot of people know about it?
I'm getting the word out there. I think that there's a delicate balance between telling users and getting users really excited. Like, hey, this thing is available. Oh, wait, here's these people gatekeeping you. So I don't want it to be a situation where people are really pounding on the door being like, when are we going to get this? But I do think it's important that, that people understand, hey, this is a thing. Please evaluate it for your business. That's kind of like the right step right now. And this is a part of that. I spoke earlier at the conference today about what this can potentially do for businesses, and I'm starting to have some more one-off conversations with businesses like, hey, this is something that I'm working on. You should seriously consider it.
Cool. And this is, and I hate to go back to it, something we talked about a bit ago, but this really is 100% about scaling. Is there any other?
Ooh, so you've asked a good question.
Okay.
You've asked like another hour-long question.
Oh, no.
The mechanism that I designed actually works for several other use cases that are not scaling related. All these things have some component of scaling because that's what the technology at its base was designed to do. But I'm also working on some of the implications for custody. So for not necessarily custodial services where you're going to be losing your own personal thing, but for if you're an exchange wanting to manage your cash, how do you do that effectively? And so that is one of the other major things I'm working on, and also figuring out if there's sort of a fundable entity there that I can commercialize and bring this out to provide services around it.
Gotcha. Do you see a way that could be integrated with opening Lightning channels and stuff? Or
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So one of the interesting use cases for Secure the Bag is if you pay out 10,000 people into Lightning channels, those Lightning channels are immediately usable before they've actually been expanded to UTXOs. And so this lets you do kind of like an instant deployment of a really large network, which is pretty cool. So you could imagine that Coinbase says, we're going to pay out 10,000 users, but we're going to pay you out in Lightning channels that are connected to one another. And so you can immediately start routing payments around the entire network. So pretty cool thing there. And then also with the routing of those channels, when you close, you can compress the payouts, the HTLCs in each of those channels into a single Secure the Bag. So that also gives a scalability benefit on both ends.
So Lightning devs seem interested?
Yeah, you'll have to talk to them more specifically. There's a few things that they're excited about, but I think that this will have a pretty big impact for Lightning too.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bitcoin.
Thanks for listening to The Bitcoin Game. Please let me know what you thought of this episode by tweeting to me at the BTC Game or by commenting on this episode's show notes page at thebitcoingame.com, where you'll also find links to topics we discussed. I still have several more great interviews from Bitcoin 2019 that you won't want to miss, so subscribe to the Bitcoin Game with your favorite podcast app. See you next time.